Okay, so thank you, and can I welcome you back then to this next session on housing, health, personal circumstances and criminality, then and now. We have 4 speakers who will all be speaking for approximately 10 minutes each, and then there'll be time for questions again. So if I could introduce Professor Anne Power, who will be speaking first, who's been involved in European and American housing and urban problems since 1965. She's Professor of Social Policy and is head of LSE Housing and Communities, a research group based within the Centre for Analysis of Social Exclusion. She's a visiting senior fellow at the Brookings Institute in the USA and leads the Weak Market Cities program at LSE, helping to regenerate former industrial cities across Europe in a more sustainable way. This is Anne sitting to my left here. Next to her is Professor Tim Newburn, Professor of Criminology and Social Policy at the LSE, and he is currently writing with Paul Rock and David Downs the official history of post-war criminal justice. Sitting next to Tim is Professor Emily Grundy, who's Professor of Demography in the Department of Social Policy at the LSE. Most of her research has been focused on ageing, with her main interest being in families, households, and social support in later life, trends and differentials in health and disability, and the long-term consequences of partnership and parenting trajectories for health and well-being in later life. And Professor Grundy has published extensively on these topics. And at the far end of the table, Dr. Suzi Hall is an urban ethnographer based in the Department of Sociology, and her work focuses on urban migration in the context of marginalised parts of UK's cities. Incorporating her previous practice as an architect, Suzi explores how to visualise global processes of migration and urbanisation and their relationships with city streets and economies. And belatedly, my name is Dr. Suki Ali, and I'm chairing the event today, and I'm based in sociology. Okay, so our first speaker is Professor Anne Powers, and she's giving an historical account of housing policies in England since the early 20th century.
Hello, everybody. Well, some time ago, quite a few years ago, probably about 25 years ago, no, a bit more than that, we celebrated the actual publication of the Booth maps in LSE Housing with an exhibition that the school was very, very pleased for us to do. And that made me much more conscious of some of the things I'm going to refer to in what I'm going to say. How did we end up with the kind of jumble of housing and streets and problems and attempts at solutions that we've ended up with today, and what sort of part did Booth and his maps play? Well, I'm going to start with a little bit of history that actually predates Booth. So in the housing world, a very big landmark for the change in approach to housing came with a woman called Octavia Hill, who, until we started working in very, very difficult council estates in the 1980s, was actually virtually unknown, forgotten. She was a co-founder of the National Trust, and with John Ruskin's support, she began her life, although she came from a very, very poor background, an educated but very poor background, because her father had become a bankrupt and then died, and her mother was left with 10 children, and she literally had to struggle to survive. One of the ways she learnt to survive was by persuading John Ruskin, because she was a copy painter for him at the age of 18, to buy terrible, terrible houses right in the middle of London that were jam-packed with tenants, because she felt so terribly upset by the conditions that those families were living in. She knew she couldn't house them. She was an 18-year-old. She had no houses. But what she could do was run those houses better. And with really, really careful management, getting to know the tenants, working out all the reasons why their housing was so abysmal, like that they were all run by middlemen, so the rents were double what they should have been. That's just one example. She actually scraped back tiny little rooms into something that were more manageable. And when we discovered Octavia Hill, when we were working in Brixton on a really, really bad estate, those of us who discovered her thought, this really sounds a bit like Lambeth in 1980. I know that'll sound extraordinary, but that's one of the first lessons that I learnt in housing, that things change and then they really don't change quite so much as you hope they would. She became a very big social reformer, and I'll say no more, except that the government, on the back of her work, actually set up a commission in 1886 to look at the housing conditions of the working class. Lord Shaftesbury was a really leading light in that. So unlike Octavia Hill, who came from a poor background, he came from a landed aristocracy background, paced the streets of London and was horrified by what he actually described as grinding down a young man who arrived in London, able-bodied, aged 20, to work, and through the life experience of becoming married, having children, and living in absolutely disgraceful conditions with no sanitation, with sewage running under the basement floorboards, as he described it, died an early death, having been crushed. His spirit was gone. And that commission actually led to quite a revolution in consciousness. Charles Booth, obviously, came after that, early 20th century, and what he was looking at was the next phase, which was what happened to a society that had industrialized and urbanized faster than any other country in the world and was crushed by grinding poverty. And he found what you would have expected, people crushed by grinding poverty, and that's what his maps show. He also showed something that I think we hadn't quite realized before, just how tough and rough those communities had become that were pushed to the very extremes, and also how concentrated they'd become, which is what his maps show. One of the interesting stories that we learned when we did our Booth exhibition is that Kingsway was demolished in the early 1900s as London grew and as it became more prosperous, as it built railway stations and banks and insurance companies and schools and all the things like the London School of Economics that came afterwards. So the poor were supposedly swept away. And of course they weren't swept away, they were shoved into smaller and smaller spaces. On Drury Lane, you can find a little restaurant called Sarastro's. I don't know if any of you know Sarastro's. That stands at the base of what was basically a men's hostel for the 600 men in Kingsway who were made homeless because they were recruited in to help build the new Kingsway. So they were brought in as workers, but nowhere to live. And that old hostel is still actually working as a hostel, but the ground floor is turned into a very, very interesting restaurant to try and disguise the fact that it still operates as a hostel. So there's a little bit of evidence. Basically, the housing conditions were so atrocious that by the time World War I broke out, landlords were able to exploit the situation. No house building going on, no movement at all, and there were big rent strikes all around the country. So the government stepped in because it was wartime, it had all the powers it needed, and introduced draconian rent controls, which stayed in place till 1989. As we thought at the time when it changed, Margaret Thatcher decided that rent control had gone too far. We had 90% private renting in the First World War. It had gone down to 8% by the 1980s. And that really squeezed the newcomers, the people who couldn't get into council housing, the people who couldn't buy. So that was a major factor in both the booming council housing, but also the exclusion of certain groups. So after World War II, by which time we'd had a big slum clearance programme that knocked down a lot more. It knocked down roughly 3 houses for every one that we managed to build in the council sector. There was an even bigger crisis, and that's when we went into high-rise, heavy subsidies for rehousing overcrowded families, more slum clearance, and basically every single inner city in the whole country blighted. London was losing population like there was no tomorrow, and yet we were building new towns. We built 28 new towns, an awful lot of which are around London, which people wouldn't move to. Why wouldn't they move? Because they were going to be too far from jobs, too far from family, too far from any connections, or they didn't qualify. You had to be in a job. You had to actually have some future if you were going to get into a new town. So we had new towns that couldn't fill, and we had people stuck in slums that were blighted. Meanwhile, other things had been going on. People said, for example, that London looked worse than the Blitz. And the population of inner London was absolutely shooting down. We can't really describe the level to which communities were disrupted, social networks were also disrupted. So in a way, it was more of the grinding of the poor that Lord Shaftesbury had seen and that Booth had seen. People really felt crushed by the process, to the point at which people started to actively oppose demolition and slum clearance. What had actually been going on below the radar was that we were in a post-war economic boom and huge immigration from the Caribbean, from India, from places like Mauritius, all sorts of places scattered around the globe where we had our colonial hands. And so as the old slums were emptied to house people into council housing that was being built as fast as the government could, a big race on numbers, so immigrants were moving into those houses, bought up by the landlord immigrants who'd come with enough money to buy a house, started off by housing relatives, and eventually we ended up with the whole Rackman scandal and a really terrible story in private renting that re-emerged. So private renting officially had been crushed by the rent controls. Unofficially, it had blossomed in the old slum clearance areas. So what were the local authorities, the councils, going to do when they came to demolish the old slum clearance areas? They decided that immigrants hadn't been here resident for long enough, the landlords weren't registered landlords, they didn't fit within the rent control system and the security of tenure system, they were mainly in furnished rooms in very, very heavily multi-occupied houses, so they were disqualified from rehousing. Huge scandal, massive homelessness, and so we actually then bravely, in the 1970s, passed 2 acts, a Race Relations Act that actually gave people entitlement to housing on an equal footing no matter where they came from. You still had to have a certain residence requirement and eligibility, but at least race was not allowed to be a factor, which it had become. And at the same time, homelessness legislation, so that people who were forced out and onto the streets, if they were within certain qualifying groups, they were a family, a pregnant woman, an old person, somebody who was disabled or vulnerable, then they would be eligible for housing. And so lo and behold, we took another brilliant decision, which was to put all those marginal groups, so-called, because they were basically poor, as in the Booth days when King's Cross was cleared, when Kingsway was cleared, into the worst places. We didn't have a private rented sector anymore. The worst places were the poorest council estates that had been built first and were oldest and hadn't been repaired for maybe 30, 50 years. And so all over London, all sorts of estates became known as the place where you put ethnic minorities, unemployed people, homeless people, vulnerable people, the groups that were normally excluded. And it was that decision that led to the marginalisation of a lot of council estates. Talking to my students today, some of whom are here, the Haggiston estate in Hackney is a very good example. That estate should not have been demolished. It was one of the estates that was targeted for rehousing the families that were evicted from the demolition areas. So we went through a housing process of building more council housing than we could use, spending more government money than was actually possible, to imagine today, and how do we all talk about the wonders of when we built council housing? And meanwhile, we were adopting policies that de facto drove council housing to the point where now local authorities think it's up for grabs, and it's fine to sell it to developers because developers can make more money out of it than councils can by housing poor people in it. And so we have a lot of estate demolition. And because private renting had disappeared so totally, and because the problem of homelessness and the decay of council housing hadn't gone away, Thatcher thought it would be a very good idea to revive the private rented sector. It has to be said that every housing person I know also thinks it's a good idea to revive the private rented sector. If you don't have that sort of fluid ability to move in cities, to arrive and find somewhere, to break up, to leave home, to whatever, to become a student and actually access private renting, you're going to be a bit stuck. So that's how we managed to do it. Unfortunately, we did it with the very opposite of rent control, absolutely zero control. So you can be evicted with no reason given after your 3 months. Assured tenancy is up. Standards are not enforced, and so on. So I could go on. So today, we've got social housing that has been heavily stigmatized. We've got owner occupation that has become so expensive that it's out of reach, even in other cities outside London. I'm making this very London because, after all, Charles Booth was London. We've got a booming private rented sector, which generally could be made positive if we had light-handed regulation and if the social landlords that have got a very good track record in providing decent, affordable, modest quality, low-income housing for low-income people on a secure basis, you just transfer that over to a decent private rented sector and you've actually got what you want. So the hope is that that will happen. But meanwhile, because local authorities now don't have enough council housing or other social housing to house the people who are potentially homeless or actually become homeless, they're put into a private rented sector where after a month or 2 months or 3 months they can just be put on the street, hence the rise in homelessness. So we are back to where Booth was, with much higher insecurity, very high levels of poverty, where right to buy on council estates is leading to buy to let, which is in turn leading to homeless families being rehoused back into council housing, but at 3 times the rent and vastly greater housing benefit cost, and with no regulation of the management of those estates, which obviously is reverting to the same concentrations or similar concentrations and exclusions as we had before. So when Booth talked about the streets of London in the way he did, and when the television programme Our Secret Streets actually captured that through history, it wasn't being made up. It is a true story, and it's a story we should be a little bit ashamed of, I think. So that's me.
Now I had Suzi next, yes? Or Emily, would you prefer? Okay. So Suzi Hall is going to talk about urban patterns of migration and marginalisation and how they have historically intersected.
Thanks so much, Nikki, for curating this afternoon's event. I've really welcomed the opportunity to reflect on the contributions of Booth's work in terms of the very current question of how migration and marginalisation intersect. In the first instance, this prompts me to think about the relationship between Britain's very long history of inequality and how this connects to the categorisation of the poor, where respectability and poverty become all too closely entwined. In Gertrude Himmelfarb's canonical thesis on the idea of poverty, she suggests that the enduring categorization of deprivation partially obscures the questions of how and why individuals become poor, and how and why they occupy a very particular social and physical space. Amongst the enormous achievements of the Booth Project was its immense scale and nuance, and therefore its ability to evidence the pervasive extent of poverty in London. Over his 17-year endeavour, Booth established a highly persuasive representation that a staggering 1/3 of London's population lived in relative poverty, and that the peak of that poverty curiously intersected with the zenith of its industrial might. While there's been significant commentary, both positive and negative, on Booth's social categories, which combine both an economic and a moral assessment, his meticulous mappings have much to tell us within and beyond the categories themselves. For me, in the first instance, this is a map of the interrelations between space and economic production. At the top of the map, we see the Thames as a thick swathe winding through the city, its edges encrusted with piers and moorings, and the intensive mercantile possibilities attached to both industry and manufacturing. We also see several red spinal cords that traverse the map, tracing not simply the emergence of a middle-class category, but more importantly for my work, the emergence of street-based economies as the rapidly expanding city required convenient access to goods and services. The Post Office Directory surveys conducted between 1881 and 1950, so they intersect with the period of Booth's work, are a terrific resource because they allow us to access the details of who occupied the shops along the streets of London. And they show how central migration is to the contribution of the so-called British High Street. So round about the time that Booth was making these red markings, we learn that this street, the Walworth Road, which I undertook as part of my PhD investigation, was absolutely made vital by migrants that had come from Ireland and from Eastern Europe and Russia. And then subsequently in the 1950s by people from Cyprus, Italy, and more recently people from a much wider parameter. The river remains central to this map. It's what Joseph Conrad referred to as the thick imperial thread that ties the city to a system of connection and extraction way beyond the confines of the nation. And it's this particular relationship between local place, who resides there, and more global interrelations has become very central to my work on marginalisation. I think in respect to Booth's work, this mapping by Greenwood that precedes Booth's mapping is also really important because the dark ink spots on this map suggest that there is a distinctive institutional landscape of poverty, and the map imprints the vocabularies of infirmaries, jails, houses of refuge, asylums, and workhouses that are closely tied up with religion, as much as it does the Victorian articulation of destitution. But now I'd like to jump a century and a half to introduce a research project that I've been undertaking really around the question of what it would mean in the context of deprivation if we were to map skill, if we were to map human capacity. For the past 9 years, I've been researching migrant microeconomies on streets in parts of cities that are classified in categoric terms as both deprived and ethnically diverse. And for the past 2 years, my research has jumped out of the context of London to 4 cities where migration has very high registers in the UK. Like Booth, our project requires an enormous investment of time in place, and we start our analysis by the very simple task of walking the street. And we spend day after day in the same location, very much engaging with a face-to-face survey of proprietors along that street. And what you can see of this mapping is an indication of where the proprietors on a little stretch of street called Rookery Road in Birmingham come from. Now, it takes you about 10 minutes to walk the stretch of the street, but in walking that distance, one begins to get the sense of how the global constitutes the local. Perhaps a drawing that might not be that favorable in the Brexit imaginary. This is a similar mapping of a street that we did in Narborough Road in Leicester, and what's extraordinary about this mapping is that there's over 22 different countries of origin that are represented in this map. But this is not simply a map of the present, it's also a map of the past. And what you can see very much evidenced and surfaced on this mapping is that there is a tie to Britain's colonial history. There's also a distinct dissonance, if you like, between what some call the overdeveloped world and the underdeveloped world. And so one of the key questions is, why is it that certain groups of individuals end up in certain parts of our cities on a repeated basis? And so when we asked this question in our survey on Narborough Road, now the survey was designed to be 5 minutes long, short enough so that we could effectively interrupt an entrepreneurial rhythm without being booted out. But most often, we extended our surveys into longer conversations. And what came out in the story of Narborough Road is really quite staggering, because it tells the very real perspective that economic and political policies are absolutely central to why certain people land up in certain places. So proprietors on Narborough Road have been there over a period of 40 years, and in the first instance, many of the proprietors came because of the expulsion of Asians from East Africa in the 1970s. What's also important is how integral policy is to this constitution. So in 1999, the Asylum Immigration Act takes a whole lot of migrants that land in the UK and distributes them to 12 cities across the UK, precisely where the jobs are not. Then we learn that the 2004 free movement through Europe becomes absolutely central, and equally the global financial crisis. So when we ask proprietors, what were you doing before you set up shop? We frequently got the answer, well, 5 years ago I was driving a bus, working in the post office, or had a job in the local authority. But of course those jobs have been very much axed in austerity governance. I'm running out of time, so I'm actually going to jump to a few crucial issues here. When we asked Asif, one of the traders on the street, how his work had been affected by the recession, he looked at me in my very white face and he said, our people have always been in recession. And what he was trying to tell me is that there's a reality for certain groups that it is not always possible to access the formal labour market, and equally it's not possible to access conventional forms of credit. So what we're beginning to see on these streets is a very high correlation between independent proprietors who are immensely skilled. In many senses, they are multilingual citizens, or if you like, citizens with 21st century capacity to engage in a national landscape. So it's not atypical for proprietors on Rookery Road to speak 2 to 3 or if not 4 languages. The kinds of economies that we're seeing are huge growth in hair and nails, halal meat, mobile phones, but we're also seeing a terrific growth in the migrant-related economy. So in Bristol, there was a huge emergence of a form-filling economy. So if you fill in my form for you, I'll cut your hair. This very much, in the case of Birmingham, becomes a one-stop immigration shop where someone takes a head lease rental, and there you'll learn how to take your English as a second language test, get your security guard accreditation. And then staggeringly in Manchester, 10% of the trade on the street is now solicitors who have set up very formalized immigration services. In starting to close up, I just want to take you to the 3 arrows that highlight some of our findings about the nature of labour on our street in Cheetham Hill in Manchester. First of all, we conservatively estimated that that little street that took us about 10-15 minutes to traverse was generating about 700 jobs. So on average, 4 jobs per unit. Now, when you begin to take that Manchester probably has 100 Cheetham Hills, and then you begin to think about the kinds of job-related potentials, it's fairly staggering. But also, 78% of proprietors on our street have a tertiary education. And 72% of our proprietors on streets were doing something else before they set up shop. So in closing, what I'd like to reflect on is just to say that Booth's legacy for me is the value of an intricate methodology, one interested in face-to-face forms of engagement sustained not only over time, but over a vast expanse of space. I would argue that we need to extend this further, engaging more with the long histories and expansive geographies that make our cities and that position certain people in certain places. Booth also provides a visual inspiration, encouraging us to develop an empirical vocabulary that is available to wider audiences and remains accessible over time. A key lesson for us in our Super Diverse Streets project is that the study of marginalisation also requires a commitment to recognition before reform and to an understanding of skill as much as deprivation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Suzi. So our next speaker is Professor Emily Grundy, and she's going to talk about her research into the health and well-being and support of older people.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, my work is mainly focused on ageing and population, so I'm going to talk a bit about some of Booth's work, very influential work concerning issues related to older people and some of the changes. And obviously one of the most striking differences between the period when Booth was working and now is the change of the representation of older people in the population. So this chart actually shows a proportion of people aged 75 and over, and in the 1890s, 1901, this was less than 2%, whereas it's nearly it's 8 to 10% now, and similar huge increases in the proportion of people over 65. And related to this, although that shift towards an older population was very largely due to falling family sizes, there have been these huge improvements in life expectancy at birth as well. So when Booth, some of the period he was working, 1841, 1850 or so, life expectancy at birth was 42, and by 2011 it had doubled. And of course, though, much of this change represents improvements in surviving to older ages, and only more recently towards gains in later life, as I will show you. So due to the different structure of the population and the different types of health risks, the predominance of infectious and diseases, whereas now it's chronic disease, a completely different sort of structure of things like age of population, deaths. So in 1901, well over a third of all deaths occurred among infants under 5, whereas now 2/3 of all deaths are people over 75. And if you think of how that relates to health and people's experiences, it's an enormous transformation. Then, as now, there were very large differences by area and to some extent between social groups in survivorship. This illustrates one of the really big changes, which has been the much greater chance of reaching adulthood and later life. But this is a bit complicated, but it compares metropolitan areas, Liverpool with Surrey in 1841, and similar type areas in the 1990s. And although the gap between these areas is narrower now, it still exists. But one of the things that happened during Booth's lifetime, and I'm mentioning this because we are here as part of the Inequalities Institute activities, was that probably the sort of urban penalty morphed, or the social class element and the urban penalties perhaps became more distinct. So if we look back to the 1890s, when period which Anne has told us, these appalling overcrowding and slum housing in urban areas, terrible sort of exposures to poor water, infections and so forth. As late as the 1895, the children of agricultural labourers were less likely to die in infancy than the children of professionals. And that's because the agricultural labourers they might have been a lot poorer, but they weren't living in places like this. Whereas by 1910, there's something a bit more, the professional, infants of professionals, their death rates had fallen, but actually the children of agricultural labourers are still better off compared to the unskilled workers and textile workers who lived in these urban areas. And of course, it's not just these kind of living environments that were risks. There were also these childhood practices There's this nice picture here of this very sort of middle-class looking family advertising soothing syrup, which its main ingredient was morphine, which is very widely used for children. If we think, though, about a further expectation of life for once people have reached older ages, we can see that really the big changes have been since World War II, really. During the later 19th century, there was not a big further gain in life expectancy once people reached that age, and these changes have been more recent. But Booth was very concerned, as we know, with the plight of older people. I'm going to come on and talk about his work related to pensions. But I first want to just illustrate the fact that if we look at the chances of people born at different periods surviving, say, to later old age, here to age 80, there really has been a tremendous transformation. So people born in 1861, only 10% of men then survived to age 80, whereas if we look at people born in 1931, over half of women born then made it to 80, and even 30% or a third of men, so a huge change. And of course, this also means that if you think of, as some people have suggested, that some index of aging we might think about is how far you are away from death on average. This shows age at which, on average, you've got 15 years to go. And you can see that there's really been this huge improvement in that, particularly in the since the 1970s for men and earlier for women. And that is now being proposed as some measure that could be related to pension eligibility. Now, Booth was hugely influential in arguing for pensions for older people. And when he first started inquiring to levels of poverty among the aged poor in London, he found much higher rates than he thought. He thought this issue had been exaggerated. But his estimates were that about getting on for a third of people over 65 were having some kind of poor law relief, and that about 40% of those over 70 were in poverty, and his definition of poverty was quite a stringent one. Interestingly, it may be that the time he was doing these inquiries, the circumstances of older people were particularly bad, because it has been argued that really it was restrictions that came in when the new poor law, which was actually introduced in about the 1830s, but it wasn't applied particularly to older people until the 1870s. And David Thompson in particular has argued that older people really until quite late in the 19th century did effectively get some kind of pension through the poor law, but the restrictions on that led to escalating poverty during the time that Booth was working. So Booth and the Royal Commission on the Aged Poor found these quite high proportions getting some kind of poor law payments or being in workhouses. And Booth was a great advocate for pensions, and which were first introduced then in 1908 with various changes. But I was interested too in the similarities perhaps between Booth's work and Peter Townsend's work. So Townsend is also, of course, very strongly associated with LSE, and some of his methods of work are quite similar. And even by the time of his surveys, he found a quarter of people over 65 were really living in severe poverty. Now today, poverty is no more common among older people than people of all ages, so the proportion of people even over 75 at only half of median incomes is about 10%, and that's not much higher than the population of all ages. But that doesn't mean, of course, that there isn't any poverty among older people. It's partly other groups have, it's just become less age established. And estimates of how much people need for a healthy living indicate that the minimum standards are probably not adequate. And then I just want to kind of finish off by talking about the other things, links perhaps between Booth, Townsend, and now when we think of the surveys that he did in the workhouses, and these show these proportion of workhouse inmates, and you can see that actually in 1901 there was this was much higher than earlier in the 19th century. These are people over 75, and it's been argued again that this is related to these tightening up of previous poor law things. When Townsend did his seminal work on people in institutions, he found a much lower proportion in institutional care, similar to the proportion now. And this is just a picture to remind you that the workhouses live on in physical form, they're still being used. And all these studies, and even now, note that it's not just poverty, but poor health and lack of family which lead people to end up in these type of establishments. And I perhaps won't go through this, but even today, there are differences in your likelihood of entering, say, a nursing or an old people's home, depending on both your financial resources and your family resources. So Booth, I think, combined this thorough investigation of major social problems with action designed to address them. And I think actually we hear that Anne is doing much the same now. The Select Committee on the Aged Deserving Poor drew heavily on his work, and he was a big advocate of pensions, which eventually came in. As I said, I think some of his methods are quite similar to those of Townsend's much later, who also combined investigation and campaigning. And in our research group, we can't obviously claim to be doing anything on the same scale, but we're very much still engaged in pursuing understanding of links between material deprivation over the life course, health in later life, and the importance of family life courses and family resources. So thank you very much.
So now we have Professor Tim Newburn, whose talk is going to be a nice surprise.
Yeah. Okay, thank you very much, Suki. The nice surprise is, it's never usually described as a nice surprise. I'm going to talk about crime. Can I add my thanks to the organisers of this wonderful event? Just the sort of thing the LSE does beautifully, and my thanks in particular to Nikki Lacey for the invitation to come and speak today. That said, it's a slightly odd subject. I'm going last for a good reason, I think, which is to say crime and criminality, which were the two things I was asked to speak to, probably rank kind of lowest or close to of the things that we're talking about in this session to the heart of Booth's concerns. They're there and very prominent, but probably not for him in those terms. They're kind of byproducts of other things that he seemed to be interested in. The second thing I'll say by way of a prefatory remark is I'm going to talk, I was asked to talk about then and now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about then than now, I suspect, but I hope in a way that will at least resonate with the kinds of things that we think about and the ways that we talk about crime and criminality in the early 21st century. So first of all, the focus is on Class A from Booth's 8 social classes. Class A being, and I quote, the lowest class of occasional labourers, loafers and semi-criminals. That was the focus. What then of the method? Well, the obvious kind of focus for Booth's work is the maps, the enumeration of the housing and the lives and so forth, the collection of data to go with those maps. More particularly, what's interesting, I think, in relation to crime and criminality is what might be called the police walks. The perambulations around London, hundreds of miles, possibly thousands of miles, in the company of mainly senior police officers. Described by Booth as guides, philosophers, and friends, just the way we all think of police officers. Those notes, collected by Booth's collaborators, as I'll say perhaps when I finish, are an extraordinary resource and possibly still a somewhat underutilised resource. So then the timing. So this is the late 19th century. The timing is important. Late Victorian England is a period of relative calm. There were good reasons to believe at the time, it certainly was believed, and I think historians subsequently still suggests that late Victorian England, by the standards of the mid-century that had preceded it, was a time of relative peace, of lower levels of violence and other forms of crime. It's also a period in which a variety of kind of new intellectual interests are emerging. Among them, eugenics, on the one hand, and one can see the language of eugenics in a whole variety of works at the time. But it's also a period in which those interests, in a variety of them, that were emerging, that would eventually coalesce under that slightly odd child we now refer to as criminology. Not a phrase largely used then, but there were emergent interests at the period. So very quickly, and just one or two reflections, and this has to be just not quite random, but just some pickings from the rich tapestry of work of Charles Booth in the period. What does it tell us? Well, first of all, I think if you compare the work of Booth with that of Henry Mayhew, it confirms the relative peacefulness of late Victorian London. The rookeries, which Mayhew described in all their vivid detail, simply didn't really form a part of Booth's picture of the East End of London. Secondly, I think, and very obviously, just as has been talked about in relation to housing, to ageing, to migration and so forth, in relation to crime, what Booth's work very vividly illustrates is the intertwining of crime with poverty and with a whole variety of other things that we might broadly describe as social problems. Those in Class A, Booth described as living the life of savages, rather Mayhew-esque language. But then, in contrast with Mayhew, he was an optimist. They were living vicissitudes of extreme hardship, occasional excesses. Their food is of the coarsest description, and their only luxury is drink. However, he went on to say, the hordes of barbarians of whom we've heard, issuing from their slums that will one day overwhelm modern civilization, do not exist. There are barbarians, but they're a handful, a small and decreasing percentage, and a degree of kind of Whiggish optimism that I think's largely disappeared from contemporary discourse. But there was alcohol in all of that. If you read any of these accounts, if you go through the descriptions of the streets in those parts of the maps coloured black, if you read the descriptions of the lives of the people inhabiting Class A, what do you see first and foremost? Alcohol. Alcohol and its consumption and the consequences of it. So a clear thread with the contemporary world we inhabit today. What are the other major issues there? Prostitution and the control or reaction to prostitution, I'll come back to that in a moment. Gambling, and one cannot help but be struck by the almost endemic presence of domestic violence. So then, what of policing? Given that these were police-led perambulations, what do we learn? Two or three things, I think. Firstly, what might, borrowing Elijah Anderson's phrase, be thought of as the code of the East End street. For the police, the communities were divided, as we well know, into the rough and the respectable. The code of the street said that the police officer was to watch and to listen and only to intervene when absolutely necessary. This was not a highly interventionist metropolitan police service at all. It simply didn't have the capability, nor would it have been allowed to, in the moral economy of the East End street. Secondly, and related to that, the police realised that their authority was limited. And thirdly, they stayed away from things. They failed to intervene in domestic violence. Indeed, they stayed away from intervention in most forms of masculine violence. Secondly, we learn about the police discomfort with the enforcement of morals. They thought enforcement of laws against prostitution were futile. The police notes suggest that the majority of officers spoken to were in favour of licensing and regulation rather than criminal enforcement. They were questioning of the expediency of the need to suppress gambling or betting. And finally, and in relation to alcohol and its control, there's actually very significant evidence from the Booth notes of quite widespread corruption, of the taking of bribes by police officers in order to organise the control of drinking in a variety of ways. Indeed, though it doesn't appear, it's almost certainly, I would imagine, the case also in relation to prostitution and gambling and so forth, what Peter Manning, 3/4 of a century later, called the invitational edges of corruption. So, finally, the legacy. And to repeat, I'll pick three things. The first is to repeat things with a slightly different inflection that have been said before. First, then the obvious legacy in relation to, in this case, crime and criminality, but it applies to the whole of social sciences, the importance and centrality of these forms of research to understanding what some universities might refer to as knowing the causes of things, and more particularly to use a variety of methodologies. Booth's methodologies were quantitative, survey methods, qualitative, quasi-ethnographic measures, and visual methods, the kinds of things we can see in displays outside this lecture theatre in the research festival. Secondly, and still on a fairly general level, I think the legacy is that Booth's work reminds us in my particular field, that crime and criminality should and ought to be understood in the context of what one might call the political economy of the city, and that without doing so, one simply fails to understand the complexity of the things upon which one is focusing. And then finally, and more narrowly, life and labour and all the things that go with it, I think, help us enhance our understanding of the relative tranquility of late Victorian London. And indeed, the lessons about late Victorian London remain just as appropriate today as I think they were then. What do we learn? That actually it's informal social control, rather than the formal presence of the state in the sense of the police or other institutions, which is at the heart of the organisation of those communities concerned. It shows the limitations of formal systems of control. It shows how dubious it is to seek to enforce through the law morality. And finally, I think, and to remind where I started, it should remind us that there's an enormous legacy of rich, relatively untapped data in the British Library of Political and Economic Science, to which students and academics should regularly turn. Thank you very much.
Right, so we did run over slightly, so we have started a bit late. Yeah. Is there a quick, direct question that somebody would like to... There we go.
I'd like to contest the idea that informal control is an adequate way. And taking the cameras on Oxford roads, which were cut down, the mortality went up. And when they put them back, the mortality went down. So you do have to have mechanisms of control. And you might like to think about mobile phones and being driving. The ordinary person thinks it's never going to happen to them. So you do have to have some mechanism of control. So would you like to answer that question?
I think that was aimed at me. I would. No, we don't disagree, and I think I possibly, in my haste, overstated what I believe to be the case, which is that fundamental to social order is informal social control, I think. But yes, absolutely, one requires formal means of social control also, for a variety of reasons, but one, and perhaps most centrally, is as the backbone for informal social control. So in the examples that you use, which could be related to traffic, for example, so there's a lot of concern now about people driving and being on mobile phones and so forth. We've been through similar kinds of concerns around speeding and drinking and driving and the wearing or not wearing of seatbelts and so forth. What one finds, I think, in relation to those things is very few of those cases are ever prosecuted. Very few of those cases are ever brought to court. The threat and the possibility that they may be has been absolutely central, I think, in changing public attitudes towards various forms of conduct. So you're absolutely right. One can't do without the formal means of social crime for a whole host of other reasons besides. And I certainly didn't want to suggest that. But I do think informal means, community surveillance, is more central.
Thank you, and I'm very sorry we started late, and we're going to have to finish because the next session needs to start absolutely on time. So I would like to thank all the speakers, and also just to say, if there were, I'm sure that the talk that's coming up, if there are other things that you want to raise, comments and questions, will be time at the end for that. So thank you again to all of our speakers.